Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. The Women and Gender constituency is so excited to welcome you to our third webinar in our funding series on funding gender just climate action. We're going to be focusing this week on understanding the multilateral climate funds and hearing from two guest speakers about those funds. As we move on to our next slide, we want to make sure that you're using the full interpretation facilities that we have available to you. So please, if you would like to be listening in French, you can use the information to navigate to the icon at the bottom of the screen. I'm also putting some instructions for both French and Spanish into the chat. I would remind everyone as well about some of our house rules: to simply mute yourself when you're not speaking, turn off your camera if it is affecting your bandwidth, and please feel free to be using the chat and sharing your questions because we're looking forward to a healthy discussion at the end. So we're going to just show how to do the interpretation in French very quickly. And I will also be sharing again the slide information. If you would like to follow along with the slides in French or in Spanish, please use those links. We're very happy to be able to provide the majority of today's presentations in French and Spanish on the slides as well. So if we can just make sure that everyone is set up in their interpretation channel, as well as if you are listening in English, make sure that you're not just on the main floor, but in the English channel, so that when we have questions and discussion at the end happening in all languages, you are able to fully participate as well. So with that, let's jump into our content this morning. I am one of your co-facilitators. I'm Tara Daniel. I'm with the Women's Environment and Development Organization. And like our other co-facilitator, Wei, we have been long engaged with the work of the Women and Gender constituency. With that, I'm excited to talk with you today about the multilateral climate funds. So if we'll go on to our agenda slide, I'll provide an overview of who you'll be hearing from today. I'm going to spend a few minutes reviewing this series, especially if you're new to it, but also if you have been following us for the previous two webinars, recapping the framing that we've been using and understanding the available resources available to the registrants of this series, before Wei does a great introduction to the multilateral climate funds and the aspects of them that we want to discuss today, since we're not doing a deep dive into every aspect of how they work, but rather what's the information that we need to know as we're considering feminist funding solutions. We then invite our guest speakers to present on the Adaptation Fund and the pathways for women's organizations' engagement in it and understanding the gender responsive aspects of that fund. And then that will be followed by the Global Environment Facilities small grants program, talking about this particular program and its long history of gender responsiveness and how you too, if you are one of our gender just climate solutions or working on gender just climate action on the ground, may be able to apply to this program. We're going to have a healthy discussion after that before closing. So with that, I wanted to recap and situate us into the context of this funding series. We've really focused on this question of finding feminist funding solutions to gender just climate action. As we know, this is what we've heard from our Gender Just Climate Solutions program. So on the next slide, we have a little bit of that background. Oh, I'm sorry, I failed to introduce our actual speakers. Young Lee will be speaking from the Adaptation Fund, as we mentioned, and we have Dolly and Angelica joining us from the Jeff Small Grants program. But with that, we will be focusing on this question of funding the amazing work that's happening on the ground on the slide before. With the Gender Just Climate Solutions and others engaged in gender just climate action, because The Women and Gender Constituency, the observer group to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, has created the Gender Just Climate Solutions Initiative and Award Program in response to this understanding of how vital this climate action is and how underfunded it is. So if this question is, how can we as the Women and Gender Constituency in our advocacy work, which is what we do, ensuring that we're embracing gender equality in climate practices and policies, including in climate finance, how can we as the Women and Gender Constituency not only uplift and elevate the amazing community-led solutions that are happening on the ground, that are the small-scale transformation, that are at the heart of the large-scale transformation we hope to see in the world with regard to climate action, then we have to be looking at this question of how to ensure climate finance is flowing to these solutions. And that's really the crux of our series. And we've understood from the beginning that this feminist funding landscape is a challenge, that the question really reaches beyond how do we access available funding right now, but as we move to the next slide, how do we transform this entire feminist funding landscape to prioritize and value women's environmental activism and gender equality. So we know, for instance, and we've reviewed in the first webinar, particularly the inadequacy of funding, whether we're talking philanthropic funding or governmental funding, in prioritizing gender equality and recognizing the importance of a transformation in feminist funding, where feminist organizations are defining their priorities and the scope of the need is being met. We also have research showing that many feminist organizations and women's rights organizations are using a variety of different funding sources, whether it is philanthropy, whether it's bilateral funding, or today we'll be talking about a few options for collaboration and partnership and for thinking through accessing other types of funding such as the multilateral climate funds. In our second webinar, we really highlighted, we were able to hear from our feminist funder, I'm sorry, if we could go back one, to the Global Green Grants Fund, to highlight the perspective of organizations that are providing grant funding to feminist funding solutions. We'd also introduced in our first webinar three particular feminist funding solutions from FRIDA and the Urgent Action Fund and Mama Cash, who we also heard from the grant makers' perspective, understanding their amazing funding opportunities, but the unfortunate reality that they're only able to fund about 1% of the applications that they are getting. So we want to make sure that we have access and recognize these avenues and pathways to feminist funding, which means funding that's appropriate for the moment, funding at the scale that we need, funding with flexibility, funding that supports capacity building and the development of organizations, while also continuing to advocate for more feminist funding and additional pathways like this. So we really concluded our second webinar with looking at a variety of resources for us to continue these conversations. And as we were doing so, we realized that we wanted to provide a space for the registrants from this webinar to continue engaging, because we've been hearing through the chats, we heard through the breakout rooms during the second webinar that there's a need to connect and share experiences, as well as network with potential funders and others. So we are happy to continue sharing, of course, the webinar recordings and slides, and we'll be placing those also on our resource page that we have for the Gender Just Climate Solutions, which contains other series of webinars, such as our communication series we did last year to help us better tell our stories around why women's environmental activism and embedding gender equality in climate solutions is so vital. So we encourage you to continue looking at that set of resources. We've introduced and shared the links to a Padlet where you can introduce yourself, and you can see there in the picture, you can introduce yourself with some information of who you are, what you're doing with Gender Just Climate Action, and who you're looking to connect with. We've also opened up our discussion tool from the second webinar, our Miro board, that captures not only what your challenges are, because we've heard a lot about challenges, but what is working for you. And so we encourage you to use those links from attending the previous webinars and that will be sent out again after this webinar to look at this information, to see the ways in which your peers and your colleagues who have been participating in this series have been really following along and engaging in these questions. And this is important because we hope to continue this work as the Women and Gender constituency and have been asking questions about what capacity is needed. So with that, we really hope to shape future resources, not only webinars, but potential publications and other ways of networking around your needs. And we hope that you find these resources useful for continuing the conversation and identifying what is necessary so that we can uplift and scale gender just climate action. We also have an evaluation that will be shared with you at the conclusion of this series. So that's a recap of where we are, and I'm really excited to now pivot to my colleague and co-facilitator Wei to provide some background on the multilateral climate funds. And the reason we're doing this session is we continue to get this question of, we know that there's climate finance out there in these big climate funds that we've heard about. How do we access it? Unfortunately, the answers to that question are not straightforward and simple, which is why Wei's presentation will start to delve into some of these complexities so that we can have this conversation for the rest of our time together. Wei?
Thank you, Tara. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to all present at this webinar. I will provide an overview of the UNFCCC financial mechanism and pathways for engagement. It all began at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. The UNFCCC was created, and so was the financial mechanism through Article 11 of the Convention. According to Article 11, a mechanism for the provision of financial resources on a grant or concessional basis, including for the transfer of technology, is hereby defined, which shall function under the guidance of and be accountable to the COP. And the developed country parties may also provide, and developing country parties avail themselves of financial resources related to the implementation of the convention through bilateral, regional, and other multilateral channels. At the same time, through Article 11 and Article 21, the Global Environment Facility, GEF, was appointed as the interim operating entity of the financial mechanism. At COP15, though labeled as a failed COP, the Copenhagen Accord did produce something positive. For the first time, the international climate finance targets were quantified. The decision states that in the context of meaningful mitigation actions and transparency on implementation, developed countries commit to a goal of mobilizing jointly $100 billion a year by 2020 to address the needs of developing countries. The funding will come from a wide variety of sources, public and private, bilateral and multilateral, including alternative sources of finance. At COP16 in 2010, the Cancun Agreement led to the establishment of the Standing Committee on Finance to assist the COP with matters related to the financial mechanism. It is also at this COP, the Green Climate Fund was established as the second operating entity of the financial mechanism. The Paris Agreement was adopted at COP21. This is significant because Article 9 of the agreement states that the financial mechanism of the convention, including its operating entities, shall serve as the financial mechanism of this agreement. The Paris Agreement also reiterated the Copenhagen Accord regarding the $100 billion commitment, where developed countries are to continue the existing collective mobilization goal through 2025. And prior to 2025, the COP serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement shall set a new collective quantified goal from a floor of $100 billion per year, taking into account the needs and priorities of developing countries. The discussion of the post-2025 goal to set new quantified targets was supposed to happen last year at COP26, but due to COVID-19, it is postponed to November this year. It will be interesting to follow the negotiations, which will be ongoing until 2024 and also include financing for loss and damage. Next slide, please. Currently, the operating entities of the financial mechanism of the convention based on the Paris Agreement are the Adaptation Fund, GCF, and GEF. They comprise 3 out of the 4 largest public multilateral climate funds. The GCF is the largest public multilateral climate fund. It has raised about 17 billion and committed about 8 billion for 173 projects, with most projects in the Asia and Africa regions, followed by Latin America and the Caribbean. As for Adaptation Fund, it was established in 2001 under the Kyoto Protocol. The Adaptation Fund only became an operating entity of the financial mechanism in 2019 after the decision at COP24. Befitting its name, Adaptation Fund only funds adaptation projects. More than 830 million were committed to over 120 projects in 99 countries, which includes 19 seats and 33 LDCs. Yonghi will be sharing more about the Adaptation Fund later. The GEF has provided 21.1 billion grants for about 5,000 projects to 170 countries. The GEF also administers the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund. The GEF Small Grants Program, which we will highlight at this webinar, supports about 25,000 CSOs and community initiatives in 133 countries. We will hear more about GEF Small Grants Program from our GEF speakers later. The Adaptation Fund, GCF, and GEF are all multilateral mechanisms that is not dominated by one or a handful of countries, and their boards comprise balanced members from the developed and developing countries. We commend that each of the multilateral climate funds has a gender policy and/or a gender action plan, and revisions were also conducted to update the policies and action plan. However, we still think there's room for improvement, especially to make the gender policy and its action plan progressive and human rights based. These 3 climate funds also have official space for civil society participation. For example, the GCF, a CSO can apply to the GCF as accredited observer. At every GCF board meeting, the CSOs could attend as observers and provide interventions on policies, funding proposals, and accreditation via the active observers. Engagement pathways. Next slide, please.
Before I go to the next slide, Huawei, it might be useful to turn off your video because we had a little interruption. Many sorries for that.
Okay. Next slide, please, Pat. Yeah, thanks. While we support the efforts made to provide official space for women's organizations and gender-related groups to engage with these climate funds as stakeholders, however, there are still many barriers with regard to their direct access to these funds. Our speakers from the Adaptation Fund and the GEF will share engagement pathways unique to their funds later on. Here, I would like to share some examples of general pathways women's organizations can opt for. First, reach out to the government focal points designated at a country level for a fund. These focal points are key to identifying opportunities within the funds. Therefore, organizations seeking to engage must be proactive in reaching out to them. Second, identifying and connect with other civil society or stakeholders who have experience with funds. These CSOs with funds experience have key insights and often a willingness to share them. And third, pursue any capacity building opportunities on climate change, financing structures, and government policy or planning. Opportunities to develop knowledge and skills should be identified and pursued, as it will add value to women's organizations and perhaps increase their chance to be part of a climate finance project. To conclude, direct access is not the best framework for thinking about how the multilateral climate funds can support grassroots gender just climate solutions or action, and how organizations can engage with these funds. We need another option. Thank you. Next, I will pass the time to Liana from Hendrik Boyle Foundation, who will be speaking on additional framing on the funds, especially GCF. Liana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Wei, and thank you to Tara and Pat and the Women and Gender constituency for convening this series. Wei, thanks for the overview. I think it's really critical, as you pointed out, that because the funds under the UNFCCC financial mechanism and the Paris Agreement are actually engaging parties, there are relatively few direct access opportunities. And while there are, with the two funds that provide direct access, which are currently the Adaptation Fund, and Young will talk more about that, and the Green Climate Fund, so far only a few civil society organizations, and those are larger environmental organizations, international organizations, have succeeded in becoming what is called accredited entities. Now, as you said, it's very difficult to get funding directly from the funds via those pathways. Women's organizations, particularly those that are working on the grassroots, would have a really, really hard time to become accredited entities. However, that does not necessarily mean that there are no financial engagement opportunities whatsoever with the funds. They are just very difficult. A number of them are indirect. And all of that has to be coupled with further continued advocacy pushes, for example, to expand the notion of small grant finance option, such as the ones that are provided through the Small Grants Program by the GEF, and we will hear more about that. So one of the possibilities, and actually where we already have seen a couple of women's organizations being engaged, is through some of the activities related in the Green Climate Fund, particularly, which is one of the funders of most readiness and preparatory support financing in the climate finance architecture and some of the activities here. There is, as part of the mandate of the GCF, the gender mandates, the gender policy, and the action plan, there is quite some interest, but also some capacity building need for entities that are engaging with the Green Climate Fund on some of the gender issues and gender dimensions. And so in some instances and cases, it has been possible to bring in some women's groups and the experience of women's groups in providing some of that capacity. There are also some engagement fora, and this is actually something that civil society has pushed quite a bit and as part of our advocacy in the Green Climate Fund, something that is called the Enhanced Direct Access, which basically would allow for an accredited entity to set up structures like a small grant facility within a country funded with GCF concessional grant financing, and that then, depending on the entity which does it, could allow some grassroots groups, and including women and feminist groups, to access some of the funding. This is still very much in the pilot phase. I think it's very crucial that in our push through for advocacy, we are making sure that some of those opportunities are considered further. And then again, we are also trying to get a better level of financing available that could, for example, be at the level of the Secretariat of the Green Climate Fund. Again, we are looking for future advocacy option to have something like a dedicated grant mechanism on that level. Lastly, I want to point out why there are not yet that many examples. I think there are some pathways for women's groups in developing countries to partner for certain project elements as so-called executing entities, as partners in direct implementation with some of the implementers of climate-approved climate projects. For all of that, though, the advocacy of women's organizations in the recipient country by engaging with the liaison to those funds is crucially important. Let them know that you are there. Let them know that you have something to offer. Let them know that you bring specific experience and capacity to bear that, for example, can be helpful in ensuring that local adaptation, implementation is most successful. And I leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Liana. We're always thrilled to have your expert perspectives after spending many years advocating and being just one of the leaders of the work trying to ensure that gender responsiveness is embedded in the GCF. So with that, we want to turn from some of the theoretical advocacy work to really thinking about what the funds are doing in terms of gender responsiveness. So it's my pleasure to introduce Young Lee, who will be presenting about the Adaptation Fund. I've been very privileged to have worked with her over the years in discussing what are the ways in which women's organizations really can engage in the work of the Adaptation Fund. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to her, and we'll begin her slide deck exploring more about the Adaptation Fund and how you can recognize different ways of engaging with it and the orientations and framing that it's using when thinking about gender.
Thanks, Tara. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank Women and Gender Constituency for organizing this great webinar and also for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and also very excited to interact with you today. My name is Young-hee Lee. I'm governance specialist and a gender focal point at the Adaptation Fund. So let's get started. Next slide, please. The Adaptation Fund is the first kind of global UN fund, which was created to dedicate its funding to adaptation projects in most vulnerable developing countries. It was established in 2001 under Kyoto Protocol and started its operations in 2007. The fund pioneered the direct access modality, which it which it helps to build country ownership in adaptation and national adaptive capacity and build on local expertise. At the beginning of 2019, the Adaptation Fund also started serving the Paris Agreement. With a growing urgency of climate change, the fund has rapidly grown into $1 billion fund today. Next slide, please. To date, the Adaptation Fund has committed over $850 million across over 120 concrete adaptation projects on the ground, directly benefiting 28 million people in vulnerable countries. It is also notable that half of our funded projects are in small island developing states and the least developed countries. The slide shows global distribution of the Adaptation Fund's projects. The respective project pictures are taken by our colleagues during the project mission. The project grant figures per region here is as of June 2020. So the figures by now are higher than shown in this slide. Next slide, please. Most of the Adaptation Fund projects are community-based, tailored to local adaptation needs, and driven by country ownership. As shown in the slide, the Adaptation Fund has financed adaptation projects in diverse sectors, including disaster risk reduction, food security, agriculture, water management, coastal management, and multi-sector. Next slide, please. Developing countries can access Adaptation Fund's resources through accredited implementing entities, which can be national, regional, or multilateral. To date, there are 14 multilateral implementing entities, 7 regional, 33 national implementing entities. As I mentioned earlier, the Adaptation Fund pioneered the direct access modality, which helps countries to build country ownership by accessing funding through its own national implementing entity. Through the direct access modality, which enhances access to climate finance and adaptation practices on ground, the fund has supported countries in sharing experiences and best practices, building country capacities through accreditation, readiness program, and also collaborating with different stakeholders, including civil society. Next slide, please. I'd like to also share some exciting recent developments at the Adaptation Fund related to the board's decision to increase countries' access to Adaptation Fund's resources. To meet the growing demands for adaptation support, our board recently raised our resource mobilization targets by 30% to $120 million per year. The board also made a historic decision to double the amount of funding that each country can access from $10 million to $20 million. In addition, now each country can have the second national implementing entity, which will further help countries strengthen their country ownership. Next slide, please. The Adaptation Fund early recognized that gender equality is not a separate issue from climate change, but it's the key to achieving more effective, sustainable, and equitable climate actions, outcome, and impact. Therefore, before adopting its own gender policy in 2016, gender equity and empowerment of women has been a standalone principle of the fund's environmental and social policy in 2013. Since then, Gender consideration has been integrated into the fund's operations, namely accreditation, readiness program, and project development and communication and knowledge management as well. With the adoption of its own gender policy in early 2016, the Adaptation Fund officially announced to move from do no harm approach to do something good, to proactively address gender equality and women's empowerment. The fund's medium-term strategy sets advancing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls as its cross-cutting themes, which reaffirms that gender is an integral part of the Adaptation Fund's work and program. The Gender Policy and Action Plan was updated recently in March 2021. The process has been multi-step and participatory process from the independent overall assessment of the implementation of the original Gender Policy and Action Plan, and also 2 rounds of public call for comments on the draft of Gender Policy and Action Plan to reflect our stakeholders' voices. The updated gender policy sets a higher ambition to achieve gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and every single stakeholder of the Adaptation Fund can serve as a gender champion, which can lead to a successful implementation of the updated gender policy of the Adaptation Fund. The Adaptation Fund Board Secretariat will also spare no effort in accelerating such efforts. Next slide, please. The Adaptation Fund as a learning institution is also committed to learning the lessons related to gender work from its stakeholders, partner organizations, and other climate funds, and sharing our experiences and knowledge with them. The fund will also continue to produce relevant guidance documents, knowledge products related to gender, making them all available on the Adaptation Fund's website. Next slide, please. The Adaptation Fund recognized that incorporating gender consideration throughout the project lifecycle cannot be achieved overnight. It requires gender-related capacity building within the implementing entities, countries, as well as gender-related support. Therefore, the fund has provided financial support for gender. For example, technical assistance grants for gender capacity building, project formulation grant, and project formulation assistant grant, which can support gender analysis and other relevant activities for project development. The fund also made available new funding windows under the Adaptation Fund medium-term strategy. They are Project Scale-Up Grant, Learning Grant, and Innovation Grant. Most of these grants are available for implementing entities accredited with the Adaptation Fund. However, non-accredited entities can also access a small innovation grant through innovation facility, which is called AFSIA. Next slide, please. I'd like to also draw your attention on the brief published by WIDO in 2020 called Engaging with the Adaptation Fund, First Steps for Women's Organization. The brief contains useful information providing pathways for engagement with the Adaptation Fund. It suggests that women's organization could pursue accreditation with the Adaptation Fund for direct access modality. But if you are a relatively small organization with a limited capacity, it suggests to engage with the adaptation fund through different pathways. That includes joining the adaptation fund NGO network, or providing technical assistance to the adaptation fund national implementing entities. Also, it can apply for adaptation fund innovation grant available to non-accredited entities. Next slide, please. You can find information on projects in your country on the adaptation website. All the project related information are all publicly available information on the Adaptation Fund website. You can go to our website, clicking, as you see in the slide, projects and program, which is under the Adaptation Fund logo. And then you can click project information. Then under table view, you can type the country name, and you will see all the projects being implemented in that country. You can also find the national implementing entity information, clicking apply for funding, and then select implementing entities, and then click national implementing entities tab, and you will find all the information. Next slide, please. Last but not least, Adaptation Fund provides e-learning courses. There are 2 modules. Module 1 is on accreditation, and Module 2 is environmental and social and gender consideration in project design and implementation. Next slide, please. So anyone can take these e-learning courses free of cost, and this is available not only in English, but also in French and Spanish. Accreditation learning module has been very helpful for the entities which are considering to pursue accreditation with the Adaptation Fund, and it helped them prepare before applying for accreditation with the Adaptation Fund. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The Module 2 is designed to help the audience understand the Adaptation Fund project approval process, also how to comply with the Adaptation Fund's environmental and social policy and gender policy during project life cycle. Also, stakeholder consultation process and other key requirements for the project design and implementation. Next slide, please. So this shows the how the e-learning module 1, the first slide, the first page looks like. And next slide, please. So this shows how to access the e-learning course, which is available on the Adaptation Fund website as well. If you have any difficulties or questions related to e-learning courses, feel free to send an email to Adaptation Fund Board Secretariat email. We'll be able to help right away. This concludes my presentation, and I'll be ready to interact further with all the audience later. Thank you. Thank you, Tara. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Young. Wei is going to introduce our next speakers.
I would like to introduce Dolly and Angelica from Jeff. They'll be sharing on Jeff Small Grants Program and on opportunities for women's organization to access the small grants. So I'll leave the time to you, Dolly and Angelica.
Thank you very much, Hui. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. If there are colleagues in the evening zone as well, very happy to greet you today. We're very happy and pleased to be able to join you at today's webinar. I want to thank Tara, Hui, at the Women and Gender constituency for organizing this very important webinar and for the opportunity for SGP to be part of it. As a way of introduction, my colleague Angelica and I come from a New York-based a small team called the Central Program Management Team of the JEF-funded Small Grants Program implemented by UNDP. My name is Dolet Sering. I'm the Deputy Global Manager. My colleague Angelica will introduce herself later as I pass the remote mic to her. Let me go into what we'll talk about in the next maybe 20 minutes or so that have been allotted to us. What we'll do is we'll provide an overview of the SGP, the Small Grants Program, and I think that's quite appropriate now that you have heard, about the overall climate financing framework, the adaptation fund. We would also like to share some information about the Small Grants Program that directly works with, small CSOs and CBOs. We'll also discuss how SGP integrates gender, share with you some of the results. Possibly towards the end, we will also share some information on how to apply to SGP grants in your respective countries. We are active as we speak in about 127 countries. Our most recent country, newest country, Bangladesh, having been just added about 2 months ago. And we'll also finally introduce SGP's work in supporting climate actions, particularly from the bottom up. Next slide, please. So in terms of an overview of Small Grants Program, I think, everyone heard a lot of the things we talk about today seems to have started in 1992. When the JEF was set up, the Small Grants Program was also set up by the JEF as a corporate program, and it was set up to provide direct access to finance, environmental finance, to provide direct access to CSOs, CBOs to address environmental challenges that deliver not only global environmental benefits, but also improve local livelihoods and lives. Small Grants Program is based on the premise that to address environmental challenges at the local level, we need to work with communities to, to empower them to take action that not only address environmental challenges, but also secures the livelihoods and improve their lives. We have so far, and I think, apologies for this, the data has not been updated, but we have so far supported in 127 countries, more than 35,000 projects. The maximum grant that Small Grants provides is up to 50,000. And we have so far delivered JEF funds alone of around $700 million with, at least another $700,000 of co-financing. Next slide. So in the midst of all these global environmental finance, one would ask why, what's special about Small Grants Program? And we posit that our value comes from 4 value propositions. The first is, given that we have more than 3 decades of experience of being a proven and trusted platform for strategic partnership for community-based actions, we provide an option for synergy, scaling up, and sustainability of local actions at the local actions for environmental change from the ground up to make changes and deliver global environment benefits. Second, because of our size, because our grants, small grants, and by nature of the name itself, are very small, very flexible, agile in nature. We are able to take risks. We are able to test, solutions, and therefore we're able to serve as incubator of innovative solutions for environmental, for addressing environmental challenges that then bigger grant, bigger projects, bigger initiatives such as the Adaptation Fund, the bigger Jeff projects can take up and scale up. Third, by adopting a landscape and seascape approach, what Small Grants Program has been able to do is focus on prior identified critical landscapes and seascapes. This not only allows us to address in a holistic way the environmental challenges, the multiple use, the multiple demands that are there in these landscapes, but also allows us to ensure larger impacts and opportunities for upscaling and knowledge sharing. Finally, and I think very relevant for the webinar today, Small Grants has a unique feature in the sense that our signature focus on social inclusion is part and parcel of our grant making, in that whatever Small Grants does in terms of grant making, we want to ensure that we maximize social inclusion. We maximize the participation, the meaningful participation of groups, disadvantaged groups such as women, youth, indigenous peoples, and also very recently we started also working with groups that are working on with people with disabilities. Next, please. Back, sorry, one slide back. Okay, next, sorry about that. So as I mentioned, in terms of the work, small grants, the grant making happens at the country level. Our grants are small. Our grants are approved by a multi-stakeholder representation called the National Steering Committee, in a very decentralized approach. So a lot of what happens, a lot of what the grant, in the nature and the types of grants are approved happen at the local level in response to needs at the local level. However, to ensure that there is global coherence, to ensure that we are able to consolidate and deliver global environment benefits, we, in addition to the landscape and seascape as the overarching approach, we have developed what we call in Small Grants Program 5 strategic initiatives, and these correspond roughly to also the Jeff impact programs and Jeff integrated programs. So these are the first is the sustainable agriculture and fisheries, focusing mainly on food security, working with smallholder farmers. The second is low carbon energy access, and particularly focusing on co-benefits. The third is community-based conservation, both in terms of conserving species, but also very importantly, working on conserving threatened ecosystems. The fourth is working on developing local to global coalitions in chemicals and waste management. And since Jeff 7, or the 7th operational phase for the SGP, which is currently ongoing, we have also introduced a new strategic initiative called the Sustainable Urban Solutions. Next, please. So in terms of where we work, again, this slide is outdated. Sorry for that. We present now in 125 countries, out of which 37 countries are SIDS or small island developing states, and 41 LDCs, least developed countries. Next, please. I would go through this very quickly because we have also this information on the website. But in terms of how you access, if you are a national community-based organization or a national women-led organization, you can access small grants to deliver the work that you do. And this is the process. Usually at the country level, the small grants program, which is led by the national coordinator and supported by the National Steering Committee, would announce a call for proposals. Even if that is not the case, you can get in touch with the national coordinator to receive information either on the next call for proposals or just receive guidance on project application, including forms and what sort of activities small grants program support in that phase. And with the assistance of the national coordinator, then you are able to then prepare a brief concept, usually not more than a page, so that the national coordinator can then guide you in terms of whether the suggested intervention is eligible for funding or not. Once that's done, then you would develop that into a full proposal. By full proposal, again, it may be misleading, but it's very, very simple proposal of 4 to 5 pages of what you intend to do, what are the key activities, what the budget layout looks like, etc. And then this is then usually submitted to the National Steering Committee, either after review by the national coordinator, or in many countries now by a neutral technical advisory group. And the National Steering Committee actually makes the decision on whether to accept and fund the proposal or to return for improvement back to the proponent. Next, please. So on this website, actually, I think I've describe all of this in brief, but on the website, in addition to these details of the application process, you will also find the contact address of our national coordinators for your respective countries. So if you are in Mongolia, for instance, you would address your questions to our national coordinator, Ganbatar. You will ask him for information, maybe even seek to meet up with him. And then based together with him, you would develop your proposal and submit it. And then, once the NSC approves the project, the grants are, usually delivered into 3 installments. Next, please. Thank you. Maybe coming to our key social inclusion priority on gender equality. A small grants program has been actively promoting gender equality and women's empowerment right from its setup. We've been very responsive in implementing also the very recently integrated the gender policy of the GEF and also the gender strategy of UNDP. Because of which we've delivered some impressive results in the area of gender equality and women's empowerment. For example, from the latest annual report, an assessment was carried out, and we found out that around 93% of all completed projects were gender responsive. What this means is all projects either actively integrating gender issues into the projects and/or we're applying gender-friendly practices and approaches in their implementation. Second, 91% or majority of the countries now have a gender focal point on their national steering committees. And this is important because, as I mentioned earlier, the national steering committees are primary governance body making decisions on which projects to support or which initiatives to fund. And national steering committees are also now supported with gender checklists, with also other capacity building measures to improve their understanding and ability to integrate gender into small grants, programs, projects, and operations. Finally, not only are a majority of the projects gender responsive, but there were around a third of projects that were specifically led by women, or what we call women-led projects. And these projects were mostly led by women's organizations, including community-based organizations. For details on our approach on gender mainstreaming, we included the link here, and you can refer to this. Next, please. So in terms of gender mainstreaming, SGP does this through two complementary strategies. First, we actively mainstream gender at the project, national, and global levels, at the three levels that SGP operates on, using various mechanisms that ensure to integrate not only that, make sure that not only that projects integrate the needs of women and men, but also that women and men, consequently benefit equally from SGP projects. So at the project level, we have several mechanisms to increase integration of gender. And these are through, for example, project proposals that require integration of gender, or at the NSC level in terms of the review and approval mechanisms. At the national level, small grants program ensures that gender is integrated into all the country program strategies. The NSC has a gender focal point, as I mentioned earlier, and all projects need to be gender responsive and, as far as possible, undertake a detailed gender analysis during the design phase. At the global level, we have developed several guidelines. The MNE strategy includes specific focus on gender, including collection of gender disaggregated data, and in our recruitment and promotion of SGP personnel. We also focus on ensuring gender parity in SGP staffing and at the NSC level. Next, please. In addition to the specific focus on gender mainstreaming, SGP also carries out dedicated programs and projects that specifically target and empower women, whereby grants are provided directly to women's organizations, increasing their ability to design and implement their own solutions to environmental challenges in their countries. But also promoting and pushing for approval of women-led projects in SGP's portfolio. Finally, in almost all the projects that SGP funds, SGP promotes supporting capacity building of women through trainings, workshops, peer-to-peer learning, etc. In the 7th operational phase, we also started what we call innovation programs as a way of targeted and focused grant making process. And under this, we have approved a women-led enterprise innovation program. And this is to really focus on entrepreneurship skills of women, and really building on the existing nature-based women-led enterprises in our portfolio. And support includes, for example, training on business management, technical training, product development and design training, marketing, financial training, etc., etc. So in this women-led innovation program, so far 13 countries are participating, from Armenia, Belize, India, Turkey, Uganda, Vietnam, and so on. So this so far is in a brief of the small grants program, the SGP's work on gender and some of the results. And also, I briefly also touched on how you can apply to SGP's grants. I Later, if we have time, we can also provide some more information. Maybe in the discussion, we can get into some question and answer and also share some of the lessons we learned. But for now, I want to stop and see if my colleague Angelica has joined, and then hand over to her to then take forward the next part of the presentation on our results in our climate change focal area.
Hello, everyone. Hello, I'm so sorry for joining late. For some reason, I had a confusion in my calendar. I thought it starts at 9. I'm very sorry, but I'm glad I'm on time for the presentation. It's very good to see everyone. And can we just move to the next slide? I will be, of course, available for any questions asked. Yeah. So, as you know, our program, as Dolly already explained, our program is working on the focal areas which are also covered by Global Environmental Facility, which respond to Rio so-called conventions, to environmental conventions accepted in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. And one of them is climate change. This is just a brief, very brief slide to explain what we are doing in terms of our focus on climate change. As you see, we provided almost 6,000 grants since the inception since 1992, since that time then the program was created. And these grants amount to over 169 million in grant funding. At the same time, every grant leverages co-financing, at least 1-to-1. So we have over 200 million co-financing as well to amplify the impact. You can find more information on the website. I also provided links on our website. Our approach is to provide catalytic financing for community level action. So as you know, climate change is a big problem, but we look at it from the community lens. And the actual transformation of our societies and economy towards renewable energy and towards low carbon development cannot be done without local level, without community participation, not just participation, without community also reaping the benefits, because this transition has to be just. And what our focus is strong on energy access, on helping the most vulnerable to transition to clean energy sources, and we provide catalytic financing for these actions, attracting others to provide more, attracting other funders. So most of our projects, most of our technologies are providing socioeconomic benefits and improving livelihoods, in addition to reducing emissions. And we are also supporting now with the COVID and the pandemic crisis that our world is going through. We are also supporting green recovery, including health facilities, access to digital technologies, which are all underpinned by energy, as well as really focusing on green jobs, particularly for youth, green jobs and new energy economy. And as always, we are targeting the most vulnerable within the countries, the poorest countries, but also poorest communities within middle income and other richer countries. Could you please show the next slide? Thank you. So just a few words about our portfolio. 70% is focused on low carbon technologies and 28% on carbon stocks, which is reforestation, preservation of forests. Many projects, as we know, because the communities are not living isolated from nature. So very many projects are addressing both, and in fact, using solar energy, for example, to replace wood and then reforest and preserve the forest are very common two objectives in our project. So we are both conserving carbon stocks and helping to transition to low carbon technologies. So as you see some results, over 43,000 hectares of forest restored. This is just for our annual report, which means from middle of 2019 to 2020, those are some of the results. 58 typologies of community-oriented technologies and energy access solutions demonstrated. As we know, of course, technology exists for low carbon solutions. However, in terms of specific applications, even in developed countries, even in the cities, very often a person who wants to do a business, renovate the house, does not have a specific solutions which would be low carbon, clean technology. What to speak of developing countries very often, and communities. Very often, yes, solar technology exists, but where is the system in the community to use this technology successfully? Also, what is it adjusted to community needs, to productive activities? And that's exactly what we do, and that's what we call our energy access solutions. They are more than simply technology provided to the community. And finally, over 44,000 households also benefited from energy access, increased incomes, health benefits, and improved services. So that's very briefly what we do. The gender considerations are focus and center of our work. And we look at differentiated needs of women and men, particularly in energy projects. Just to mention a few projects that correspond to all those principles that I just said. One of our very successful projects in is the tea production, Secret Grand Mère in Madagascar, where women who were disadvantaged, widows, single mothers, without sources of income were given, sorry? Am I over the time? We're given solar energy to start production of teas, which became a very successful enterprise. With this money, they were able to pay for education of their children and improve their livelihoods. This is just one example of the projects that encompasses this productive activities focus and gender considerations. So I will stop here. I don't want to take too much time, and please, we'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Young, Dolly, and Angelica. We are so thrilled to have your inputs. I'm going to hand it over to my co-facilitator, Wei, for the first question.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Tara. From the chat, we have some participants asking, how can we get funds from for our organization, and how do we get opportunity for capacity building? So these participants come from Senegal, asking for project funds opportunity, and for Marshall Islands, someone asked about capacity building opportunity, and Brazil, they are asking for, is there any opportunity at all? So from our speakers, Young, Dolly, and Angelica, if your programs have projects or funds opportunity in these countries, could you please elaborate and share on what has actually happened and what are the opportunities? Yeah, thank you. Yong-hee, can't hear you. Can't hear you. No, can't hear you. No.
How about now?
Yes, good.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry for the glitch. So yeah, let me address in the order of the country that Hui mentioned that. So for the Senegal, so there is a national implementing entity called Centre de Suivi Écologique. That's, as I remember, CSC is the very first national implementing entity of the Adaptation Fund. So if it, as I mentioned it earlier, now the board raised the amount of funding that each country can access. So actually, if my recollection is correct, Senegal tapped into almost 10 million, but then now the country cap has been raised. Therefore, there is a funding available in Senegal. And also the board now allows the country to have a second NIE. Therefore, although there is one national implementing entity in Senegal, there is an opportunity for any other organization to apply for accreditation from now on. So for the further detailed of the accreditation process, I think I sent a direct link to the audience which raised this question. So the accreditation process information is all available in the on the adaptation fund. One thing to mention is the accreditation process is something the entity cannot just start on its own. It needs to get endorsed by the designated authority of the country. And on our website, all the designated authorities information is available. So you can find it on our website, who is the designated authority. For the adaptation fund, unlike the GCF, designated authority is a government officer, not the ministry itself. So that information is available. The endorsement letter from the designated authority is is a requirement to start the accreditation process. Also, as I introduced the Adaptation Fund's e-learning course on accreditation, that will be really helpful. If you are interested in accreditation, I would suggest to take a look at the accreditation process information on our website. You'll be able to see what are the required capacity you have to demonstrate. And you may want to assess whether your organization has been equipped with all those required capacity, and to decide whether accreditation process is a suitable pathway for you to engage with the Adaptation Fund. For Marshall Islands, I believe there is a project, Adaptation Fund project in Marshall Island, and there is no national implementing entity in that country. So what we also encourage the countries where there is no national implementing entity is that when the project in your country is implemented by multilateral implementing entity or regional implementing entity, we also encourage multilateral implementing entity or regional implementing entity to engage with national entities in the project, so they could further build their capacity through the project. So that's one way when there's a project, or if you have information that certain project is being developed, the proposal. So we encourage them to engage in the project. You might not be an implementing entity, but it could be an executing entity, or now because in the Adaptation Fund, since 2013, gender consideration has been a requirement throughout the project life cycle. So therefore, that there are opportunities that, let's say, grassroots organizations or women's organization could engage in those projects. In Brazil, as I also directly text in the chat box, that so far, Brazil has not accessed Adaptation Fund's resources. The very first step for the country to start engaging with the Adaptation Fund is that it needs to designate, nominate the designated authority. Brazil had not done before, but in recent few years that the Brazil has nominated the designated authority, which is a first step to officially engage with the Adaptation Fund. So I think it will be, or it may be in the future, the project where Brazil will tap into adaptation fund resources. Hope that it clarifies questions.
Thank you, Yong, for such comprehensive explanation and clarification. Dolly and Angelica, do you have anything to add from a small grants program?
Thank you, Hugh. Maybe just to add, first, small grants program is present in all 3 countries, Brazil, Marshall Islands, and Senegal. And as I mentioned earlier, periodically the country program issues the call for proposals. So I would suggest that you be on the lookout for that, but also reach out to the national coordinators. You can find that on our website, and I believe Angelica has also shared it in the chat. Reach out to our national coordinators to find out, what sort of projects are being funded in this in the next call for proposals, what the timeline is, but also to just generally to also get information on the project concepts, templates, etc. As for the kinds of projects, and I think this was a question from Marshall Islands, SGP definitely supports capacity building. In fact, that is one of the main reasons or main approach for SGP, in the sense that the result of the SGP projects are as much its focus on capacity building as on the final objective of global environmental benefits itself. So this is very much integral part of SGP's approach. What I would request is you reach out to our national coordinators for more information. Maybe Angelica, you would like to add something. Over to you.
I've been also responding in chat. I send links to the programs. So as I said, in Brazil, we've been historically focusing on Cerrado region. So not all communities would be eligible. So you have to see what's the situation now. I'm not sure, but I think it's maybe the same focus. The other ones I also sent you, Senegal, we have a program in Marshall Islands as well. And in Mexico, I'm just about to send a link. We have focusing on Yucatan Peninsula, so regional focus because of the amount of funding in some big countries. We focus on regions. There was another question in terms of what are the criteria for the project elements, aspects you look for that lead to sustained funding and financial independence? Well, it's a very big question. We give seed funding, so to say, right? It's a very small funding on community level, 50,000 mostly, so 150 in case of strategic projects. So yes, in some projects that move somehow to higher level, it varies from country to country. Sometimes they receive, or even the regional, the region within the country receives 150 to solidify some of the results. However, of course, then there is a gap in terms of financial independence. So what we try to do, we have our Grantmaker Plus, so to say, our dedicated time of our coordinators, ourselves, and some funding to actually help our grantees to find next steps. So we have this niche, and this is one of the issues that we're working on also with Jeff, how to pick up where we left off, because we can't continue funding to bankability, let's say. We have a different focus. So that's a short question. So yes, sustained funding then comes from other programs.
Thank you so much to our speakers for providing these insights into environments that we know are more complicated. And I think these questions are starting to get at that. And part of this series was about asking questions that if as Young presented in her presentation, that if gender equality is key to achieving more effective and sustainable and equitable climate action, how can we better direct funding to these solutions? And as we've been having these conversations, I think we see that many times we have more questions than answers. And what we're committing to you as the Women and Gender constituency is that we're going to be continuing to journey with you to find more answers, to find more feminist solutions, to determine the best advocacy that we can do, recognizing that, for example, some of the recent enhancements to the adaptation fund on raising the country cap or allowing additional NIEs were because of additional climate finance. And as the Women and Gender constituency, we're constantly advocating for greater ambition in climate finance. So we want to recognize these ways in which the advocacy we're doing at an international level should be informed by what is needed by solutions on the ground. And I know that we haven't had a chance to go through all of the questions in the chat, but we will follow up with you if you have put a question in the chat. So this is your last chance to put something in that transcript. And we are going to continue on this journey. We'll be sending out an evaluation about this series, getting more of your ideas about what you need so that we can provide better direction and navigation and just partnership as we, for example, are trying to find the right information for your country, trying to identify the opportunities that may be best suitable for you across feminist funders, across governmental funders, and eventually against other funding opportunities as well that we'll be exploring as the WGC. So thank you so much for joining us for this series. Thank you to our amazing interpreters for allowing this series to be accessible. And we will be following up with a link to all of the resources and posting all of this information where it will live indefinitely on the Women and Gender constituency website. Bye all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.